Mingo asked me to be brief with my introduction, and I will fail. I've thrown the other 3 pages away, so we'll just see where this ends. Auditor Clarence Mingo's life and career have been about service to his country and community. A veteran of the United States Army, he served honorably with the coalition forces that liberated Kuwait during the 1991 Persian Gulf War, and we thank you. He was a graduate of the Ohio State University for both undergraduate and for his law degree. He worked as an attorney in private practice, helping protect those citizens most in need, and including being appointed as a guardian ad litem, which is a child advocate representing the interests of children in abuse, neglect, and divorce cases. Served in the Legal Aid Society of the Columbus Neighborhood Services Project. Is one of 3 attorneys who represented indigent county residents with legal issues involving housing, public benefits, bankruptcy, expungements, civil protective orders, and custody matters. He worked hard to expand and further develop the project's reach and influence on the indigent population here in Franklin County. In 2007, he was appointed as a commissioner in the Ohio Court of Claims as one of 7 commissioners with statewide appellate jurisdiction in victims of crime cases. Then, in 2009, Clarence was appointed as Franklin County Auditor and has since been elected for full terms in both 2010 and 2014. As auditor, Clarence is responsible to Franklin County residents to offer the best public service in fiscal, real estate, and consumer protection. From his own bio, Clarence is committed to seeking new and innovative ways to expand the services of the auditor's office into each resident of Franklin County. A strong fiscal conservative, Clarence will look for ways to streamline county government and always put the interests of taxpayers first. He was married to his wife, Angela, who's with us today. They were married in 1992. The proud parents of Annalise and Ava, and they live in New Albany. And that's all I'm going to say about, and all we are going to probably hear much about County Auditor Mingo, because this really is about, I think, Clarence Mingo and his observations from this position. On the program committee, many people request the opportunity to speak to us. Most are turned away. Auditor Mingo asked to speak about racial issues, and the programs committee was not about to say no to him. Last week, I called Auditor Mingo and asked him why and his motivation on this topic. And we talked about several things, including how events like Ferguson have not happened in Columbus, Ohio yet. Also about how removing the Confederate flag from the grounds of the South Carolina State House does remove an affront, an offensive symbol to many people, and it has merit. But that perhaps when we remove the Confederate flag from Walmart and other retailers, we have done nothing more than to move an issue out of our sight, and we're missing an opportunity for a meaningful conversation. ColumbusRotary, for today's topic, which is race in America, I am pleased to introduce to you Auditor Clarence Mingo.
Right, well, good afternoon. We'll try that again. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Very good. I'm Clarence Mingo. I serve as the auditor of Franklin County. And I thank you so very much for your time and attention today. It's a real pleasure to be among you today. I will tell you briefly that I have made a few observations about you very fine Rotarians. One, you are very hospitable towards your guest. I thank you, and I certainly appreciate that. I also have observed that you are very much eaters, right? You are watching you consume that food, and you're doing a fine job of doing it. I've come to talk to you about a serious topic, but a fellow Rotarian who's here today thought that I should first announce a 0% tax break for all Rotarians. Right. I will give that thought when I return to the office, and we'll see what the dispatch has to say about that. These are interesting times in which we are living in the United States of America. There are any number of serious topics for us to undertake, likely none more pressing the homeland at this hour than issues surrounding racism, the concept of race. We have watched over the last 18 months or so as American cities have literally burned with black Americans on this side and white Americans on that side, trying to figure out and otherwise determine how to resolve this very aggressive and resurgent issue of racism. Names like Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, cities like Baltimore, Maryland, and Ferguson, Missouri, now echo in our hearts and minds of symbols of a very difficult subject matter that we as Americans are struggling to grapple with. Today, I hope to offer a roadmap. I hope to begin a dialogue by which we can begin undertaking and understanding the issue of race and how best to address the remaining vestiges of this cancer that continues to inflict itself upon America. This conversation is difficult. It is the type of subject matters that most of us often either A, don't know how to pick up and address, or otherwise cringe at when we are discussing it, because it strikes at the core of who we are, and all of us are opinionated and have thoughts about this issue. But we must begin talking about it, and we must begin talking about it in a meaningful way. As we look back over the last 18 months, I have asked myself, how can it be that in the year 2015, Black Americans and white Americans still don't fully understand each other? I think back to my days at The Ohio State University when I was in the student union on a very prominent day in American history. This was the day that the O.J. Simpson verdict came down. Angela, my wife, and I were students at the university at that time. And the verdict was pending, and there were white students on this side of the student union and black students on that side, and all were tuned in to CNN. And as the verdict came down, it was, as you know, and history currently records, not guilty for Orenthal James Simpson. And on this side of the student union, African Americans cheered by the hundreds and chanted deliverance and justice finally. And on the other side of the student union, I watched as white Americans jeered, cried, and some booed that this was the verdict. And I was simply confounded that there could be that type of conflict and lack of consensus in America over even an issue as simple as justice. And the answer we are seeking is how? How can this be? How can it be that in 2015, Black and white Americans still have yet to fully understand each other? I once knew a young man who, at the age of 5, pedaled his bike maybe 2 miles away from home. It was he and another little boy. They were all African American, and they were surrounded by 3 white men. And one of the white men pulled out a sawed-off shotgun and said, I will use this word, so brace yourself, "Nigger, you have 5 seconds to run." And so the little boy did. He pedaled all the way home. Sometime later, this same young man moved from a predominantly black housing project to a white, middle-class housing suburb. And the boy and his family each morning were routinely greeted by neighbors on the left with a "good morning, nigger," and by neighbors on the right with the same adage, "good morning, nigger." Now that little boy stands before you right now. He is serving as your Franklin County auditor. But I ask you, why is it that within my heart there is no darkness, there is no hate, there is no feeling of injustice towards my fellow white Americans? The reason is because my mother, and I vividly remember this, demanded that I love and know my white brethren. I remember that hot summer of 1980 in which my mother, standing on our porch, lectured my siblings and I and said, "You will love and you will know your white brethren, and you will make no distinction among them based on how a few have treated them." I share this story with you because it is the first clue and the initial answer as to how we must begin this dialogue about racism. The answer is love and fellowship. We must come to love each other, and thereafter we must have fellowship. And what is happening in America at this hour is the exact opposite. We hardly know one another. Most of us in this room at this very hour have been unlikely to have someone of another race or perhaps another religion or a different culture in our home for dinner. We may encounter each other on the job, we may see each other shopping, and we might have friends, but that doesn't constitute fellowship. It doesn't fully constitute love, and we will not overcome this issue of race until we learn to love and fellowship with one another. I'm a Christian. I'm also an African American and spent many years of my life in a predominantly black church. Some time ago, Angela and I decided, after waking up Sunday after Sunday and seeing all black Christians every single Sunday, we decided to ask ourselves, how can this be? How can we all worship the same God, read the same Bible as Christians, and yet when Sunday comes, We rarely fellowship or otherwise know each other. Indeed, we go right down to the heart of the issue and determine that we will fellowship separate and apart. So we've been worshiping for the last 7 years at a predominantly white church, if only to demonstrate that love and fellowship constitute the key recipe to ensuring that racism and the last vestiges of it are absolved completely. But this is challenging for us because there's a faction of our heart, there's a side of our heart and soul that finds it difficult to deal with this issue. I can think of many of my African American friends who would cringe if their black son brought home a white bride to be. I can think of many of my white friends who would cringe if their daughter announced that she was marrying and thereafter planned to have biracial children. Very difficult subject matter for us to undertake and begin discussing. That initial conversation is difficult because of the lack of fellowship, because of the lack of fundamental love that we have for one another. We as Americans have the responsibility to do better in this regard, and we must. Because we as a nation cannot afford to move forward into a future that is increasingly reflecting people of color. We know factually, according to the 2010 census, that by 2050, the majority of Americans will be people of color. And there are some African Americans and perhaps some Latinos who clap and cheer. No need for that because we will all be Americans, irrespective of where we fall on those racial boundaries. But in between now and 2050, our responsibility is to ensure that we are growing in love and moving towards fellowship concerning one another. A second point that we must undertake, and this is one that is difficult and is best highlighted by discussing the recent Supreme Court decision surrounding gay marriage. Now, this too is another issue akin to racism that has deeply divided Americans, with some on the right embracing traditional or biblical marriage, and then some on the left embracing same-sex marriage. And I remember vividly, nearly 4 weeks ago when that decision came down, I found myself in social circles, political circles, religious circles. And again, we as Americans could barely begin having a meaningful conversation as to how we would handle this decision and as to how we would move forward as a nation. Allow me to highlight a path forward. Number one, we must understand that we are individuals and therefore we are all entitled to be people of convictions. Convictions simply represent those core values, those core beliefs that you have that are unshakable. They never change. They constitute your very character. They are who you are. They are convictions. And we as Americans are free to be people of conviction. That simply means if you believe in traditional marriage, you have the right to believe that. Conversely, if you believe in same-sex marriage, you have the right to believe that. What must remain in between the beliefs on the right and the beliefs on the left, or the belief in traditional marriage or the belief in same-sex marriage, is simply, in a word, respect. All of us must respect the individual freedom we have to see the world as we so desire and to embrace the values and belief systems that we so choose. Instead of respect, we as Americans are demanding conformity. The people on the left are demanding that you see the world the way we do, that you adopt and conform to this perspective. And people on the right are no better. They are demanding that you see the world this way, that your voice and perspective must be conservative. I believe in the concept of conviction, and I encourage those on the right and those on the left to embrace that. But in between convictions that are opposing one another must be this word called respect. And respect does not mean that you are duty-bound to abandon your convictions. Respect doesn't mean that you conform. It simply means that you respect the freedom, the individual right, the individual God-given right that we all possess to see the world as we so desire and to embrace the value system that we choose to believe in. And it is simply un-American as we move forward, both from a political and philosophical perspective, that we, in great measure and increasingly, are demanding conformity. I rarely give a political speech, but I must admit that I stand before you as a Republican. I'll tell you, it's an odd thing to be an African-American Republican. I got to whisper that, right? But this has been difficult. It has been very difficult subject matter for those in the Republican Party, difficult subject matter for those in the Democratic Party. And those difficulties exist because we are bent on, we are consumed with the idea of conformity. And in a democracy like ours, with the type of freedoms inherent in the Constitution, where liberty prevails, where the foundation of our nation is built on freedom of thought, belief, and independence otherwise stated, we must understand that we are free to be people of conviction, but we must be people of respect. Not conformity, but simply respect. The third path going forward involves this concept of understanding. This understanding. Now, I've given to you 2 points of very difficult subject matter. Racism, confined as perhaps an African American to someone who is white. The issue of gay marriage, involving someone who believes in traditional marriage versus someone who believes in same-sex marriage. And when you put those issues together, we need to look very carefully as to how it is we must live relative to those issues. And in a word, and my third point would be understanding. We must live in a way that reflects understanding. There are some facts in this nation that we cannot overlook. We can't overlook the fact that women in this nation on the dollar make 14 cents less. 14 cents less than a man who does the same work. That simply means for every dollar a man makes, a woman, by and large in this nation statistically, makes about 86 cents. We can't overlook the fact that unemployment for African Americans is 11.4%. For whites, it's about 5.3%. We can't overlook the fact that home ownership for African Americans is 43.5%. For whites, it's 73.5%. The poverty rate for whites is about 9.7%. For African Americans, it's about 2.7%. Now, we need to carefully look at these statistics. And first, we must acknowledge them as true and therefore problematic. But thereafter, we have to live with understanding relative to those issues. I employ a host of people as your county auditor, and I've appointed many women to leadership posts. And looking at such facts, I'm reminded within my heart and mind to look at those women and understand that the potential for discrimination, the potential for injustice, the potential to treat them differently based on the dark vestiges that remain in my heart, based on tendencies that have long survived in American society, those tendencies must be examined, studied, and otherwise discarded. Otherwise, I too, failing to live without understanding, will repeat patterns of behavior that have long since hurt and have otherwise formed to prove discriminatory against women. Likewise, with the issue of poverty, home ownership, and employment, the statistics I've read are only true and are in existence for only one reason. The only reason identified by government and sociologists, and that would be race. Some of us find it hard to believe that in 2015, that Danielle is more likely to get the job over Deshawn. We find it hard to believe that Monique is less likely to get a job over Michelle. And poor Abdul, well, Abdul is not going to get that job over Alan. And that is merely based on his name alone. And I look at you as a predominantly white audience, and you might think that I'm talking primarily to you, but I'm not, because discrimination knows no boundaries. It knows no color. It is no respecter of gender. All of us are capable of making decisions and inducing behavior that discriminates based on the color of a person's skin, the type of religion they have, or even the way their name sounds. There was a story that was posted on Facebook that many believe to be true, or perhaps it's an urban legend. In either case, it undoubtedly is meaningful. This story tells about a young Hispanic gentleman, well-educated, who had a master's degree. His name was Jose. And Jose applied for job after job, time and time again, and on rare occasions scored an interview and certainly never landed a job. What Jose decided to do was to drop the S from his name, and Jose became Joe. Joe got a job quickly with his credentials. Jose did not. And the reason, undoubtedly, is because of his racial identity. The very reflection of his name was enough to steer those who might otherwise be interested in him away. And the challenge with this is that this issue is pervasive. It doesn't stop with the white American. It is not limited to the man who is African American, and it's not limited to the person who might be a woman. All of us are capable of behaving in such a way that the worst of society, the very thing that our nation does not represent, can be reflected in our behavior if we do not live in a manner that reflects understanding. Now, this we must do. Names come to my mind as I stand before you. These are names like Treblinka, Sobibor, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz. These are the names of Nazi concentration camps that dotted the European skyline from 1939 to 1945. And those places existed primarily because German society at that time had lost the God-given ability to love. They were no longer willing to fellowship with those who perhaps were not like them. They no longer lived in a manner that reflected understanding. And absent love, respect, and understanding, you get 4 letters, H-A-T-E, hate. America must live in a way that reflects a conscious knowledge about these issues. And we must no longer be afraid to address these issues. We must understand that we have a history in this nation that is painful, and it is difficult for us to talk about. But today, I want you, primarily white Americans, to know that you owe African Americans nothing. I understand the past 150 years of slavery. I understand what happened in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. I understand the liberation that occurred in the 1960s and the progress we've made thereafter. And there are some in this nation who live with what we might call white guilt. That debt has long since been settled. And you no longer need to live with the guilt and shame of what may have happened 150 years ago. Our challenge as a group of Americans in this time in our history is to move forward and to display conduct towards one another, both black and white, perhaps heterosexual or homosexual, in a way that simply reflects love, fellowship, understanding, and respect. That is our goal moving forward. That is the great challenge of our time, and we as Americans must embrace this. Our failure to do so will surely mean the end of the great society that we have forged over the last 215 years. So why am I telling you this? Why does all this matter? The reason is because we as Americans cannot afford to be distracted by issues called racism or perhaps gender or other forms of discrimination. We cannot afford to be distracted. The reason is simply written on the headlines that you are easily and capable of reading today. You can look in the Middle East. There's a group emerging quite strongly called ISIS. This group is terrorizing, beheading, and gobbling up nations from Cairo all the way to Baghdad, one nation after another. You can look on the Korean Peninsula and watch a resurgent North Korea threaten the world by way of nuclear arms. You can look in Ukraine, where communism in the form of Vladimir Putin is once again emerging. We as Americans cannot afford to be bound up and distracted by issues here in the homeland because the world needs us. We have a duty and sovereign obligation to be that shining light, to be that example, to be the watchman, indeed the lookout and lighthouse for the world. But we are not capable of doing that if at this very hour we are consumed and otherwise lost in issues that should have been resolved long ago. Issues that are easily resolved merely by the use of words, fellowship, love, respect, understanding. These are concepts we should be embracing. And our failure to do so will mean the loss of dominance, the loss of prestige, and the loss of influence internationally. Some around the globe think the world can do without America. I think otherwise. History shows that without America, the world fails. And our generation must not be that generation that is so consumed with issues here on the homeland that we are failing to look out for our vital interests around the world. Why do these times matter? Let me give this to you by way of story. As mentioned, I'm serving as your auditor. I've been in Franklin County for 23 years now. I've been married for 22 years now to Angela. I hope that 22 is right. Did I get that right? 23, sorry. Close. But Angela and I have 2 little girls named Ava and Annalise. And they are at this hour ages 9 and 10. In fact, they start school 2 days from now. And some time ago, I had the good pleasure of bathing them. I was bathing them jointly, taking a shortcut. Guys, you know all about that. So I had them both in the tub at the same time. And I was sharing with them that there are many things for which they should be grateful, to include warm bath water. I explained to them that I'm a veteran of the first Persian Gulf War, what you might recall as Desert Storm, and that as a result, I went many weeks without bathing, and certainly without the benefit of warm bath water. And my then 4-year-old Annalise asked a good question. She said, "Dad, what did you do during this war?" And I told her, well, I drove a tank halfway across Iraq, and then we swung up into a very small and then unknown country called Kuwait. And she followed up with another good question. She said, well, Dad, what type of tank was this? And before I could respond, my then 3-year-old Ava interjected and said, Dad, was it a fish tank, right? Was it a fish tank? Now listen to me, true story from the heart and mind of a 3-year-old. Okay, so why did Ava ask this question? Well, you know the answer. In the mind of a 3-year-old, a tank is a tank. There's no distinction. Not so with the times in which we are living. These are very distinct times in the United States of America. And it is no coincidence that our generation is once again facing these titanic social issues that, if not addressed and thereafter resolved, will easily consume us and do away with all that we have forged over the last 215 years. These are distinct times. We have a distinct responsibility, and we have distinct strength and history at our side upon which we can draw lessons and thereafter insight as to how we can move forward. I've mentioned words to you that you know all too well. You know how to love. You know what it means to call someone who is African American while you sit as a white American and get to know them on a personal and individual basis. That is called fellowship. You know how to live with understanding, knowing the statistics, knowing the facts, knowing that there are challenges and those challenges are real. You know how to behave with respect to those challenges. These are things we can do, and we as Americans must not fail. The challenge has been issued. I dare you to accept it and to meet it head on. I'm Clarence Mingo. Grace and peace to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for a great talk. Your thing about civility and respect. What do you think we can do about the political process, which we're already well on the way to for the president? The pie chart of energy that goes into that that's entirely in the opposite direction of civility. Is there anything that you can comment about that and any solution?
Yeah, absolutely. Without mentioning Donald Trump. Yeah, sure. The question is, in the political realm, what can we do to encourage civility, given the Republicans and Democrats heating up? And I really believe this, that the answer to that question, what can we do with civility, it starts with the candidate. It starts with the candidate living and talking about those values. And the challenge is, all of us, even your county dog catcher, is surrounded by political advisors who will tell you, don't talk about those issues, and if you do talk about them, this is the way they must be addressed. We need to be authentic with one another. In our political leadership, both Democrat and Republican, we need to begin real, meaningful, hard-fought dialogue about these issues. And I think that's the answer. We must have the courage, the intestinal fortitude to stand up and to address these issues in a meaningful way without hesitation. Ma'am.
I'm a German person. I was born in Berlin, and when I came over here, I was called a Nazi and chased, and beat up quite frequently. So I understand discrimination. The one thing I am looking forward to is the day when we're not going to be African American or white American, but if we all want to be Americans, then we need to drop those kinds of symbols and not have strict associations just for African American or just for white American, but we're all Americans. Why don't we drop that and say we're looking at each other with respect? We don't need those labels.
Yeah, there's a secret that I will tell you. If you were an African American crowd, this would strike you in a way that would be all too familiar. I cannot give it to you from the standpoint of someone who is white because I don't know it to be true. But as an African American, I will tell you this. There is great distrust in the African American community towards our fellow white Americans. And this is shameful. I'm sure it exists on the other side, but as an African American, I can tell you in our community, that distrust is real. There's a reason why if you go down to the short north on a Friday night, you won't see a lot of African Americans. You'll see them in the King Lincoln district. There you will find us, but we won't venture out into places where African Americans predominantly are not found. And the reason is because we don't trust one another fully. We're not confident that that fellowship will be what it should be. We doubt one another. We don't believe in one another, and we don't believe we all have each other's best interest at heart. I can tell you that is true in the African American community, and I regret it. I regret it, but on an individual basis, I'm doing my best to do something about it, and you have the same challenge. I mentioned earlier that Angela and I intentionally moved to a church that was predominantly white just to demonstrate that we are not bound by our color to a certain body of believing Christians. And we must all undertake those challenges if we really are to be a people of one. E pluribus unum, right? Out of many, we are one. That is the great maximum that we embrace here in America. We have to live that by way of action. And we'll go one and then two. Sir?
You referred to this as a primarily white audience, which it clearly is. There are some of us who have been concerned with that fact for a long time. This is being said by a person who was integral in our having our first of two black presidents of this club, because I refused to let him refuse to be that. So my question to you is, why don't you join this club and help us recruit minorities, not just yours, help us recruit minorities?
Boy, that's a challenge, is it not? Here it is. I will join. I will join. Yeah, I'll join. Yep. I will join gladly. Thank you very much for the invitation. Sir.
Only about 30% of the African American children enjoy the two-parent family that you're providing, compared to about 70% of the white or Caucasian families. What can be done to encourage two-parent minority families to stay together and help raise their children?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm happy to address it. I will give you another hard truth. It is a shame. It is a shame that we as African Americans will protest, we will demonstrate all day long in every city of America when a white cop kills a black man. We call that a civil rights violation, and we launch federal investigations into that type of crime. Conversely, when a black man kills a black man, we say very little about it in our community. If we have the same passion that we have on this side when a white police officer kills a black man as we do on this side when a black man kills a black man, we would be well off, we'd be well situated, and we'd be on the right path. But we don't, because we're so consumed with racial injustice that we are not willing to deal with the very difficult issues of our own community. And I have challenged African Americans to ask ourselves, why is it that so many other black men are killing black men? Why is it that so many African American children are born fatherless? Why is it that so many black men are incarcerated or otherwise incurring misdemeanors and felonies? These are the issues in our community, and they are real. And we as African Americans, we cannot blame white America for that. Those issues we own. Those issues we have to do something about, but it starts with the individual. It starts with the individual. And my ancestors, many of them who lived in the 1930s, 40s, and certainly the 60s, would turn over in their grave if they knew the type of community and the type of challenges that we have voluntarily brought onto ourselves. They would literally be ashamed that the greatest generation of African Americans to ever live in this country is currently embracing a form of nonsense that our ancestors could undoubtedly not be proud of. But it starts with the individual. I stand before you as a man, not perfect. I can guarantee you that. Not perfect. There's no perfection embodied within me. But I understand the concept of striving for excellence by way of example concerning my living. I understand that. So I'm duty bound to my wife to honor her. I plan to be in the lives of my children, and I plan to model for them what a man is. I don't need Al Sharpton or Jesse Jackson to tell me how to be a black man. I got that from my father, but he was in my life. And other African Americans have to own up to that responsibility, accept the fact that we are failing, and then start to live, again in a word, right. Yes. Yes, sir. Yes.
Do you think media fuels the fire?
As a guy who's been victimized by media, I won't discriminate. But I do. It is true, by way of example, that media will quickly cover the white police officer who kills the black man, perhaps unjustly. What they won't cover for very long is the one black man who kills 4 other black people, because that is not a story, that is commonplace. So in dealing with those issues, we do find that media only covers that which is likely to garner ratings. That is no surprise, but it is doing great detriment to the underlying and other issues that are affecting not only the African American community, but also our nation. All right, grace and peace to you. Thank you.
So I just want to take a moment and salute you for how brave you are and were to come to this group and bring this important topic here. Now, until then, be a Rotarian all week long.